This is the Week in Sustainability from Workiva Carbon, formerly Sustain Life. It's where our team of experts and practitioners share weekly insights and commentary to keep you up to date about all things sustainability.
Welcome back to another week in sustainability. I'm Hannah Soksky, a sustainability data analyst on our sustainability team here at Workiva Carbon, and I'm joined by a new face to the podcast. Sean Cuthbertson, our solution lead, is here with us today.
Hey, Hannah. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm a longtime listener of the podcast, and I'm looking forward to diving into this week's topic with you. Our topic this week is one that is personal to both of us, and that's the recent and ongoing big storms hitting the southeastern United States, with Hurricane Helene and now Milton forcing my family to evacuate their communities and your inability currently to go home. Let's dive into the increasing severity of big storms and how it requires changes to disaster and climate policies.
Yeah. So we'll be throwing a lot of statistics around. Statistics and numbers are something I think both of us anchor on, but just leading up top that these storms hurt people and we are not losing sight of that. So when we think about these storms, why are they worth paying attention to? Let's refresh and think about Hurricane Helene, which made landfall on September 27th. Helene hit the west coast of Florida as a Category 4 hurricane. And then Milton is expected to make landfall on October 9th as a Category 5, and maybe a slightly less than a Category 5, but with less than 2 weeks between these hits. And these storms are worth talking about because they fall into our expected patterns that we often think about with climate change and what climate change will do to our weather systems. So NOAA at the beginning of this season projected that this would be an 8 to 13 severe storm hurricane season. And these predictions are coming true. We saw Hurricane Beryl in June, and Hurricane Beryl was unique because it was a really early Category 4 storm for June and then really quickly intensified into Category 5. We also saw Helene have sort of unusual behavior and maybe slightly unpredicted behavior. The amount of energy that it carried with it from a warmer Gulf carried it all the way into Appalachia and caused some really intense damage to a dam system up there, and also massive landslides that caused devastation throughout the area. And then we have Milton, which, similar to Beryl, has intensified really, really quickly. I woke up on Monday morning with the alert that it had gone from Category 2 to 3, and then just 3 more notifications throughout the day that it had gone all the way up to Category 5. And this is just falling into the pattern that we can expect.
Yeah, it's sad and it's crazy how quickly something so devastating can just become the new normal. I think maybe we should back up a little bit and touch on how climate change is driving a lot of this. And, there's a couple main ways that it does. One of them is, with hurricanes getting their energy from surface water temperatures, as atmospheric temperatures are rising from global climate change, much of that heat is passed into our oceans, powering these bigger storms. But also higher sea levels are just making things worse with, melting polar ice caps. And also just as oceans warm, they expand. This is driving, storm surges, or the walls of water that are pushed on shore from these big storms, to just be all the more devastating. Coastal flooding is now, exacerbated. And as you already mentioned, going further inland than we'd otherwise expect. Storms, and also you mentioned storms are becoming less predictable, with communities barely able to breathe before the next storm comes barreling through. And with Category 1 suddenly becoming, over a span of hours, 4s and 5s, just continuing the displacement of communities and preventing folks from, protecting their homes even just a bit before the next storm comes through. I know we both know that this is a global phenomenon. It's not only, this type of thing isn't only affecting our loved ones in Florida, but it's affecting people around the world. The week before Helene made landfall in the States, Storm Boris flooded large portions of Poland with the equivalent of several months of rain all in one go. And in the same week, another example, Nepal faced flash floods, which led to an estimated loss of life of 215 people.
Yeah, and when we're thinking about how much damage is happening so quickly and everywhere, it leads us to finally see those links as to how climate change starts to slowly collapse our systems and we can't function in the way that we're used to. And a big way that this shows up is in what we can depend on with insurance and with our economic function. So, all of this damage, it wipes out homes, it wipes out businesses and jobs, families are displaced. Um, but a huge fallback for storms like this is like, well, do you have insurance? And plainly, the ability to have insurance is becoming less and less and less accessible. So typically, insurance companies fall back onto reinsurance, and reinsurance takes up a massive amount of risk to allow insurance coverage to be offered to nearly everyone. That is starting, the entire structure of the insurance market is starting to change because actuaries are recognizing the reality of climate science. Our running 10-year average of dollars lost because of these catastrophes sits around $37 billion. But just last year in 2023, we saw that number exceed $100 billion. And then in the first half of this year, in 2024, that number is already sitting at 62 billion. And primary insurance that relies on reinsurance to offset that risk can't fall back on that anymore. Reinsurers have ramped up their prices, and primary insurers are forced to, handle the bag themselves. This then impacts consumers when we see insurance companies pull out of states like California and Texas and Florida because they just simply know that the cost is going to continue to rise.
Absolutely. And, insurance is a huge piece of the puzzles when communities are trying their best to bounce back. And while, you know, maintaining your insurance is a huge challenge, the funds that you do get when you get them offer an opportunity to build back in a way that's more resilient. Um, and, this can be including reinforcing homes to withstand hurricane force winds, constructing flood barriers. I know my aunt and uncle are looking at upgraded drainage systems, elevating roads in flood prone areas, and making sure that the critical emergency response systems are equipped to handle these escalating disasters. And another trend that we're seeing is that governments and communities are increasingly looking to protect and expand some of their natural resources, like wetlands and mangroves, that can actually help protect against future storms by preventing a barrier against storm surges. And of course, as you and I know, some of these systems also have the added benefits of sucking in carbon dioxide from the air and mitigating climate change as well. Adaptation is costly, though. Retrofitting cities and coastal areas comes with a huge price tag. The cost of building seawalls along Florida's coastline might exceed $75 billion in the next decade. And Miami is spending millions of dollars on flood control systems and elevating roads in the hope that this will save billions in avoided future storm damage. Around the world, we're seeing new techniques for how to build more resilient infrastructure. The Netherlands is leading the way in some areas that with their advanced flood protection systems that serve as a model for other European countries and around the world for coastal resilience. And, while there's a lot of great ways for us to build this resilience, resources are being stretched thin and the pace of these storms is relentless. We're looking at a situation where infrastructure just isn't able to keep up, even when we know what we need to do. Florida's Gulf Coast has long been considered. I've always, remembered even when I was little that it was one of the most vulnerable areas in the U.S. when it comes to hurricanes, particularly because of the storm surge risk. Yet, despite all these warnings, we're seeing that the preparedness just isn't anywhere near where it needs to be.
Yeah, and Florida is just such an interesting case here because it's one of those states where the policy environment really does frame adaptation and climate planning as something that runs in opposition to business interests. We see this over and over again. We understand that there's been severe damage to coral reefs because of commercial fishing industries, and we see that there's massive damage to, underwater ecosystems in favor of building ports, both for, cargo and also cruise lines. I think moments like this, when we see storms be this like non-discriminating in their damage and how much they can interrupt supply chains, how much they can threaten businesses, how much they can completely ruin a business, they're just as vulnerable. And, insurance access is declining in the same way for consumers as it is for businesses. And Florida does a good job when a storm actually does hit. There's a really solid bipartisan coming together to meet consumers' needs or constituents' needs at that time. But prior to a storm hitting is when we see actions like earlier this year, Governor DeSantis basically erasing the language of climate change off of the legislative priorities. Um, those consequences are what we feel now. Communities were not allowed to use climate projections in their planning efforts. Um, and now they're facing those consequences without being able to fully account for what they would be encountering.
So yeah, great call out. And while, planning can be done even without some of this language, it's really a hindrance when you can't use some of the scenario modeling that, governments and academics around the world trust. And, climate adaptation is such an important piece of the puzzle, given that, it's really going to prevent some of the, you know, social and emotional and also economic losses from some of these hazards. But on the other hand, we also have climate mitigation opportunities that focus on reducing the factors that are driving climate change and driving the increasing severity of these hazards. So this means cutting your greenhouse gas emissions by transitioning to renewable energy sources, improving your energy efficiency, and adopting more sustainable agricultural and industrial practices. And while these come also at a cost, some of these technologies are increasingly becoming more profitable or at a level that is as comparable to other technologies that are more carbon intensive. And, long-term mitigation is essential to prevent these storms from becoming even worse. But, it's estimated that achieving net zero emissions globally, even with these falling costs of these technologies, could cost $1.5 trillion annually through 2050.
I think mitigation, being prevented from having the right policies in place, both when a disaster hits and doing everything possible to prevent them happening in the future, is where policy isn't allowed to do everything that it's really capable of. DeSantis is actively preventing renewable energy from growing in the state. There's much that can be done, and both adaptation and mitigation are completely necessary. Focusing only on one without addressing root causes is a losing battle. It's an uphill climb. And at the same time, communities will need immediate help to protect against the storms that are already here. So I think when we back up and think about this in the context of what companies can do, it's all about having a larger lever to push adaptation and mitigation forward. Individual people can only do so much, but mandatory corporate reporting is growing both in the United States and abroad. That's fantastic. What that is hinting towards, and really where it needs to go, is for the business community to recognize that they're the people with the power to really shift our emissions in a different direction. More aggressive action will not only benefit us now by, stopping investing in fossil fuels that are only getting more expensive, but also benefiting us in the long run. Anything mitigated now means something that we don't need to adapt to in 10 years.
Absolutely. And, you can't mitigate what you can't measure. And so obviously we both find a lot of reward in the fact that our jobs support the increasing reporting of emissions data and the transparency and cross comparability that this allows investors to have, where they can make choices that they know that their money is going to, investments that align with their values and with their objectives. Companies have more leverage than consumers when it comes to pushing these adaptation and mitigation opportunities forward. And it's more aggressive action now is only going to benefit us in the long run. With all that said, thanks for tuning in, everyone. Our thoughts are with those who are impacted by these big storms in Florida and around the world. And thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.
Workiva Carbon provides organizations with an easy-to-use solution to manage the full life cycle of measuring, managing, and reporting carbon emissions, now integrated into the same platform used to manage the world's most trusted financial and non-financial reporting. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this show on our YouTube channel or your favorite podcast platform. See you next week.